Hello, everybody. Here we are again. This time we have the pleasure to have with us Mr. Matt Thornton. Hello, Matt. How you doing?
I'm good, Claudio. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to have you in my podcast. I saw you. I tried to invite you. I said, okay, he could tell me no. So why don't we try? And I would I would like to ask you first. Um, just I swear, just one question about Jeet Kune Do, then we we move on. Okay.
Yeah, whatever you want.
Um, you started with Jeet Kune Do martial arts, or you have some basic experience before?
My dad put me in karate when I was a kid, but I only did that for maybe 6 months. So I had a little bit of karate, and then I had done some boxing. And when I was in the military, just a little bit. When I got out of the military, I was adamant about wanting to spend my time training martial arts, and I had chosen Jeet Kune Do is where I wanted to go start training because of the cross training and the stand up and the training all the different ranges, and to me it looked practical. And so when I left the military and moved back to California, I started training in JKD. So that would my first real martial art would have been Jeet Kune Do.
Okay, so speaking about martial arts in the beginning,
Mhm.
what do you think is best for a young kid?
I like I say in my book, I think what's best is combat sports. What works
Mm.
in a fight is fighting sports, and the reason why fighting sports work is because they're results matter. They want to win, and so they have functional training methods. Whether we're talking about wrestling or judo or boxing or any of them, so any of the combat sports are going to be great. The problem with boxing and Muay Thai and some of those arts is the head trauma, and that's especially not good for kids. So my recommendation for kids is to get involved in some sort of grappling art. You've got wrestling, you've got judo, you've got Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Those are all great. Obviously, personally, I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's what I put my kids in. I think that's in many ways the perfect martial art for kids. So that
Same
would be
for
my
me.
recommendation.
Same for me.
Yeah,
I got two kids, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
there you go. It's healthy. They're not going to get brain
Yeah,
damage. They love it. It's perfect for kids.
yeah. Um, so you started with the Jeet Kune Do. You became really famous, not exactly for Jeet Kune Do, but for some people call it functional JKD.
Mhm.
Do you agree with that name?
Yeah, that was the name I chose for my first videos, but it wasn't so much about Jeet Kune Do as it was about that's where I was coming from. And what I was trying to do is I was trying to explain a question that had interested me all my life since I was a kid, which is what works in fights and what doesn't. What martial arts work and what martial arts don't work. Despite what some people say, there are certain martial arts that absolutely do not work, and in many ways could actually make you worse at fighting. And I wanted to know the difference. I wanted to know why some arts work and some arts didn't work. And in the producing of those videos, which we called Functional Jeet Kune Do, the point of those was to explain that to people. I mean, there was techniques in there, and there was boxing and jujitsu and all everything else, but I was using those as a vehicle to explain aliveness, and that's really what it was all about. Since then, my gym has an organization has grown. We're essentially a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, mixed martial arts, functional martial arts gym. And so some of our locations focus more on law enforcement and self-defense. Some of our locations focus heavily on MMA and professional MMA. Some of them focus more on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so forth and so on. I have two myself, and we do stand-up clinch and ground. We have wrestling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and boxing and Muay Thai at my gyms here. And so that's kind of where the organization SBG evolved to. But those initial videos, that was the title we put on it. And the first group of people that came to me and became basically the original instructors for the organization around the world, most of them had come from a Jeet Kune Do background. So they had similar background. They understood what I was trying to say. They agreed with it, and it kind of that message helped gather them together.
Do you think you attracted more people from JKD concept or also the original? Or maybe the people from original wanted to stay in the background of Bruce Lee?
I've trained with most of them. in one way or another, not extensively, but I've certainly met them and trained with them, and I've talked to a lot of them. I have respect for all of them. I think in many ways both went wrong. I talk about that in the book, and I've talked about that publicly before. But the problem with original Jeet Kune Do, if we call it that, is you're mimicking the fighting style of a 130-pound man who was primarily a movie star and died in 1973. Not to say he's not a great martial artist, but he had limited contact by that. He was only 33 years old when he died. And the idea that you take anybody, even if a world-class fighter, let's say Sugar Ray Leonard, right, at his prime, are most people going to be able to fight like Sugar Ray Leonard? No. The fundamentals of boxing will transcend different individuals, and each individual has to take that delivery system and learn how to make it work for themselves. But you're not going to mimic, boxers who mimic Muhammad Ali or Sugar Ray Leonard most often don't do very well. They've got to learn how to make boxing work for themselves. And so that's the problem with the original group. They've basically turned it into a fixed style of trying to mimic what Bruce Lee did when he was alive. The problem with the Concepts group is a lack of discrimination. Like they had some arts that were very functional, Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, of course. Some of the first people in the United States to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu were actually Jeet Kune Do people. Hal Faulkner, who was I think probably the first, and he was a student of the Kali Academy under Dan Inosanto, and he started training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu actually in the 70s because he had gone to Brazil and seen it. As far as I know, he was one of the first Americans to do it. Of course, Paul Vunak and others, Richard Bustillo. So they had really functional martial arts, and then they had other stuff that was just no other way to put it. It's just silly. And there was very little discrimination between the two. So the analogy I've often used is you go to an all-you-can-eat buffet, and a lot of it is really healthy and good for you, and a lot of it's just garbage. And you don't learn how to develop your own fighting style by mixing and matching from things like that. That's not how it works. So you develop your own style by focusing on the fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground. And those fundamentals will transcend bodies once you learn what they are, the body mechanics, the footwork. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it has to do with the base and the posture and the connection we have to our opponents. Those are universal. And then through a process of alive training, you learn over years. It takes years and years to really earn your own style. You earn it. You don't learn it or pick it. Through a process of alive training, you figure out how your body best manifests those fundamentals, and then you have your style. And then as a coach, if you're smart, and you're ethical, your job is to then go back and allow your students to go through the same process you did. So you're not teaching your style, you're introducing them to the fundamentals of stand-up, clinch, and ground, weapons, whatever it is that you're training. And then you're letting them, through the process of alive training, again, develop their own style. And to me, that's really what, if you just boil it down, and it doesn't, a lot of times these kinds of things are semantic. We're trying to think what Bruce Lee meant when he was alive and read his mind, which none of us can do. So it's almost pointless. But in my personal opinion, that's what Bruce Lee was going after. That was the idea. That's what Jeet Kune Do should have been. It was about truth in combat. Let's find out what works. Let's find out what's real. And ideally, they would be the top MMA fighters in the world right now, would be the Jeet Kune Do community, because they should have had such a head start on this whole game. But they hung on too tight to a classical mess. It may not have been traditional karate or kung fu, which they rightly compared themselves to and showed why what they were doing was superior, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, they adopted equally silly things from Southeast Asia and Penjak Silat, all kinds of other stuff, which doesn't have any application against fully resisting opponents. You're not going to see that kind of thing used in a cage. And so the inability to let go of what didn't work really held them back.
Okay. If you look back in your life, your experience in martial arts, can you see different phases of your experience from Jeet Kune Do to functional JKD to MMA, or you see it just like one flow?
No, there was definitely an evolution. In the beginning, there was no such thing as an MMA gym, right? So when I started teaching Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Rickson Gracie, I had nowhere to train it. I only started teaching because I wanted training partners. I didn't think I'd ever do this for a job. Had no concept that I'd be able to feed my family doing this. I thought it was always going to be, I always have to have some other job, and this would just be a hobby that I loved. And the only reason I started training was because I needed training partners. That was it. And there was nowhere else to go. There was no Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools. There was no MMA schools in Oregon. And so I was the first one. And we made a lot of mistakes. The biggest mistake was we trained too hard. It was too much head contact. The sparring was too rough. And as the years went by, we evolved, all of us in the organization, because we care about what we do, and we're always trying to find better ways of doing it. We evolved better training methods where, now I'm very proud to say at my gym here in Portland, we have 700 some odd students here, and some of my coaches are in their 70s. You could come on a given day and you could see people in their 60s. You could see young athletes in their 20s. You can see doctors that are 50. You can see women. Probably 30% of my overall membership is female at this time. Kids. So it really is for everybody, and everybody's training in a very realistic way, but nobody's getting hurt. And so it took us years to develop that, and I talk about that in the book. And that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to write the book, because you shouldn't have to repeat those mistakes. My students should have the benefit of not having to go through what we went through. So that was probably the biggest evolution. And then the more I've trained, it's been 30 years ago, more than 30 years since I started SBG. The more I've actually fallen in love with jiu-jitsu, and the deeper I see the fundamentals of the art going. Sometimes people talk about, when we focus on fundamentals, that being boring, or how you might run out of techniques or anything. And anytime you hear somebody talking like that, you understand that they don't understand how the art works, because the fundamentals, whether we're talking about jiu-jitsu or wrestling or boxing, are deep, and you could spend a lifetime just working the fundamentals of any one of them. So I never find it boring. And I've learned more. I've been a black belt now for whatever it is, 20 something years, I think. I've learned 23 years. I've learned more jiu-jitsu in the last probably 3 years than I did the previous, 28 or 30. And I can't think of too many other things on planet Earth where that would be the case. And so there's definitely been an evolution in a positive direction for us.
Okay, you are 1969, right?
That's when I was born.
You can still learn in the last 3 years. You got no problems with knees?
No,
I'm 1968. My knees are totally fucked up. I wanted to start again Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I tried, but my left knee is totally done.
I've had 5 knee surgeries.
Oh, okay.
A hip replacement. I've had ACL replacements on both my knees. I had a full hip replacement last year. I've had my share of injuries and surgeries, and part of that is because, as I was talking about earlier, I trained too hard. I trained too rougher than I needed to. Knowing what I know now, I can tell you with absolute confidence that if you're with a group of people or a coach who knows what they're doing, there's no reason why you can't train and not get hurt. If you have injuries, bad knee, bad shoulder, pretty much whatever it is, with the exception of maybe your neck, because if you get a neck injury, then you really do have to stay off the mat.
Yeah.
But anything else like that, you can learn how to work around it. And if you have a smart coach and a smart training partners, you shouldn't get hurt. One of my black belts, she started with me, Lily Pagel. She started with me when she was, I think, 51 or 52 as a white belt. She got her black belt in, I think she was 63 or 64, 12 or 13 years later. And she's still teaching to this day. And she's in her 70s, and she rolls. She gets on the mat. And she's tiny too. She's probably 100-something pounds. But it can definitely be done. So one of the things is, I think a lot of schools still to this day train rougher than is necessary. The beautiful thing about jiu-jitsu is you can get very good at it and learn how to defend yourself well against big, strong people by training softly if you know how to do it. You can still have the timing. You can still be completely alive, but you don't need to be getting picked up and slammed on the mat. And you don't need to have submission slammed on you. Like, none of that stuff is necessary. It doesn't make you better. If anything, it just breaks your body down. So I think the secret is to learn how to train that way, and then to find a group of people who know how to do it. And that's growing as more people do jiu-jitsu, smarter people are getting involved, and there are more schools that are like that. And this first book that I wrote, I was more about violence in general, how to manage it, how to deal with it in your life, how to protect yourself and your family, and a little bit about training martial arts in terms of what you should look for and what's functional, what's not, aliveness.
Okay.
But it wasn't a training book. It's not filled with drills or anything like that. My next book that I plan to write will be, and one of the main
in the 70s, you remember, in the 70s, in the 80s, it was full of people of books like that. But now we have internet, we have YouTube, so there's no need anymore to write books like that.
No, we don't need picture books. But the reason why I want to write this next book is because I want to get across to people how to train that way. And so the next point of my next book will be specifically about how you can train in a healthy way.
That was my last question. Your next book.
Yeah.
Are you already writing it?
Yeah, I wrote a lot of it already. I wrote 3 times what made it into this book. So I've got that. Basically, this is a huge book, and it's 300 some odd pages with 600 citations. Very data heavy. I talk a lot about a lot of things, police shootings, all kinds of other things, crime, all that. So in order to pare the book down, I really had to take out all the parts about training. There was sections in stand-up, clinch, ground, jiu-jitsu, and we just had to cut that out. So that'll go back into my next book, and I'm going to flesh that out more. But one of the reasons why I really want to do it is because, I want to pass what we've learned in SBG along to everybody else so that they don't have to make those mistakes. Like, nobody should have to get beat up to learn jiu-jitsu. If you want to do it to prove to yourself that you can manage it or whatever, or to understand what it feels like, I get that, and you can put yourself through that to the degree that you find it necessary, but it's not needed. You can learn how to fight without it.
Yeah. Do you have still hope for some traditional martial arts, or you don't have it?
No, not really. I mean, it's not about the art, it's about the training method, right? Mm-hmm. And the problem with traditional martial arts is they're basically sclerotic patterns. So they're dead patterns. Person A does this and person B responds this way. And they lack that aliveness part. That's why the one thing about training that I did include in the book was an entire chapter on aliveness, because I think once somebody understands that concept, they can no longer be bullshitted by fake martial arts or pretend martial arts. But if you take something like Aikido, for example, right? Which Aikido can, beautiful looking art. Grant you, it can look very cool. It looked cool when Steven Seagal did it Above the Law and came out in the movies and made the first movie. It looks awesome, but it's not a functional martial art. And if you try to apply Aikido in a cage, you're just going to get beat up. And if you try and apply it against somebody in the street, a football player, you're going to get beat up. I mean, it's not going to help you learn how to fight against a bigger, stronger, angry opponent with bad intentions. Yeah. Now, if you try to modify Aikido to make it functional, right? Let's say you're a 3rd-degree black belt or whatever in Aikido, and you want to functionalize Aikido. By the time you're done with it, you're going to wind up with something that basically looks kind of like bad wrestling, judo, and jiu-jitsu. And so it begs the question, why wouldn't you just go to do wrestling, judo, and jiu-jitsu?
Directly, yeah.
Why would you want to remake the wheel? So as long as the instructors and people who are teaching that are honest about what they're doing, I have no problem with it. Like, if they're teaching Aikido for cultural reasons or to get people moving or for health or whatever, that's fine. But the moment they start telling people they're teaching something that's practical for self-defense, they've veered into an arena where they could get people hurt. And so, you have to tell the truth at that point.
Okay. And you think the same about self-defense classes?
It really depends on the class. So most of what people need to know about self-defense isn't physical, right? It's all the pre-physical stuff, which is basically what my book's about. So understanding how violence works, how people get selected, how predators select their prey, how to get yourself off that deselected, unselected off that list, how to be a harder target, where to go, where not to go, how to listen to your own internal instincts. One of the big points in my book is that, we are very successful creatures in the sense of evolution. Every one of us, easy to forget and an obvious point, but when you think about it, it's quite profound. Every single one of us, including you and I, every single one of our ancestors not only lived long enough to procreate, but lived long enough to procreate and their offspring procreated in an unbroken chain, all the way back to the beginning of mankind. Completely unbroken chain. 99 point whatever 999% of every other creature on the planet, including humans, didn't do that. They died out, right? So you and I come from a very successful lineage. That didn't happen by accident. Our ancestors had fantastic instincts as far as who was a predator, who was a parasite, who they needed to stay away from. Many of them defended themselves over and over in all kinds of different situations. Many of them had to kill for you and I to be here today. And all of that is in us. It's in our primal instincts. And what happens is we get isolated from that. We get away from our physical nature. You get stuck behind a desk. You're looking in a glass screen. You forget about primal instincts. You lose touch with them. But they're still there. And then when you're in the presence of a true threat, those alarm bells will go off, but people don't recognize them. They don't know what they are, or they try and rationalize it away because they want to be a nice person. They don't want to appear like they're judging someone, whatever. And then before you know it, it's too late. And now they're another victim of a violent assault. And so just learning how to trust and listen to your own instincts is probably the single most important thing you could do to defend yourself, right? And the physical conflict part of it, when it actually turns physical, that's at the end of a long process. Usually there are many, many steps before you get to that point that hopefully if you learn how to manage, you can avoid ever getting to that point. Once it gets to that point and it becomes physical, if you're somebody who's a combat athlete, they're in your world. Somebody grabs me on the street and tries to hold me or something like that. That's what I do every day. I'm a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu person. They are now in my realm. You're going to be fine. Your body's going to take over and you're going to probably dominate that situation. People forget how easy it is to beat up somebody that doesn't know Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or MMA if you have skill set in that kind of training, right? Doesn't mean we don't need to be aware. Doesn't mean you don't want to respect. There could be weapons. There could be multiple opponents, of course, right? But once it turns physical, that's where functional martial arts and everything will just kind of take over. But all that stuff before that is what's most important. And if you learn to pay attention and listen to that kind of stuff, I think most people can avoid most potential conflicts. And the last thing I'll say about that is, whether we're talking about rape or assault or murder or anything else, the vast majority of the victimized know who the attacker, right? So we spend a lot of time in self-defense thinking about strangers attacking us on the street. And of course, that is something you have to learn about too and learn how to manage. But more often than not, male and female, the person who's going to attack you is somebody that you know, somebody that you've let around your life, somebody that you've let into your inner circle, so to speak, or into your home even. And so learning how to manage those boundaries and get those kind of people out of your life is also very important. So I talk a little bit about that in the book as well.
To write a book, you must love books. So what you usually read?
I read all kinds of things all the time. So I've got a huge pile of books that I usually read 3 or 4 things at a time. And I'll read a little bit from one book and then switch to the other. Every once in a while, I'll get so engrossed in a book that I'll read it from start to finish. Happens rarely, but does happen. And 90% of what I read is nonfiction. So I like history and philosophy and science and things like that. I'll occasionally read fiction. My wife reads a lot more fiction than I do. When I read fiction, it'll usually be older, more classical literature or sometimes science fiction that I enjoy. But yeah, I read a lot of nonfiction.
I know that you really love philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a philosopher that you think would be great for martial arts? I mean not Eastern philosophy. I'm thinking about Western philosophy.
Sure. In terms of Western philosophy, the Stoics are always worth visiting, and one of my favorite is
Yeah.
Western philosophers, probably Marcus Aurelius, and his book Meditations is usually always on my bedside. It's one of the few books that I always keep close to me. I've found a lot of practical advice when it comes to managing violence and everything else from him. So there's a lot of good material there. In a broader perspective, talking about life itself, I've always been very fond of Spinoza.
Okay. Um, um, there are many books. I collect a lot of books. I love books,
Me too.
as you, and I collect a lot of books, and I read a lot of books like those from Desmond Morris,
Mhm.
Harris, Lawrence, Carley, all books that speaks about the behavior of animals and the aggressiveness and
Mhm.
how it works and what happens in the brain. Did you do some research, and did one of these books inspired you?
Absolutely. A lot of those books inspired me. So I got the idea for writing this book around 2014, so 10 years ago. And I was having lunch with a writer who I respect a great deal. And he's actually the one that told me, I told him I've been kind of working loosely on a book about martial arts for a long time, but I hadn't quite figured out where I was going with it or where it would fit on the bookshelf, because what I was writing wasn't the kind of book that I thought would fit well in the martial arts section of Barnes and Noble next to, Jiu-Jitsu University or something. And he said immediately, "You're writing a book about violence. That's what you're writing about. It's violence, and it belongs in the nonfiction area where those kind of books are held." And when he said that, I knew he was right, and I kind of lit a fire under me to focus in that area. And I did two things that took a few years. The first thing I did is I just went and looked at the raw data. We have a lot of crime data, particularly in the United States, from the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics and things like that. And I just wanted to look at the numbers by themselves without any input or narration, um, and just to see them for myself and see the story that they told. And they do tell a story. Anybody who's interested in just looking at the data should do that, and you'll start to see a narrative that's very different from the one that the media puts out about how violence works, not just in this country, but worldwide. Although, obviously getting data from a lot of different countries can be tricky, but the United States does a pretty good job of tracking that. So I did that. And then the next thing I did is I wanted to read everything that was on the market about violence and make sure that nobody had written a book that I wanted to write. And so I did that, and nobody had. I read a couple hundred books on the subject. And then one of my interests for many years has been evolution and evolutionary psychology, and
The
so
Oscar Zarate.
yeah, I had a lot of that material already, and so a lot of that went into the book. So, like I said, at the end of the book, there's I think 600 citations, all kinds of references to the data and things I talk about. But we talk about violence from an evolutionary perspective, why it evolved, and how it evolved, and every other aspect that you can think about. So my goal is whoever reads the book, I want them to be able to have a good relationship with the topic. Violence is such a intrinsic part of our being. It's so important to how we evolved that, with the exception of probably reproduction, with the exception of probably sex, it is the thing that gets most fetishized. In other words, people will glorify it and turn it into some kind of fetish, especially young men who are, lacking maturity, or people will demonize it and repress it. And either extreme is not healthy. And I want people to have a healthy relationship to the topic of violence. So that's one of the overarching goals of the book, is that by the time they read that, they'll have a better understanding of where it sits in each of us.
Do you think that writing a book whose title is The Gift of Violence could be risky in 2024 in a society like we are living in right now?
No,
That
no,
people can misunderstand the title.
yeah. No, not at all. Actually, the idea for the title came from a book agent that I had, and in some ways, it's an homage to the gift of fear. So, of all the books I've read on violence, was the one that I recommend to people besides my own the most often is The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker. He wrote two fantastic books. One was The Gift of Fear, that I think everyone should read, and the other one was Protecting the Gift, which was about protecting your kids. So, if you're a parent, I always recommend that. And his overall thesis was similar to what I was talking about before, that he interviewed thousands of victims of crime. And although many of them at first glance, and when you first start talking to them, will say that they felt like it came on very suddenly, all of a sudden they were attacked. If you ask them the right questions, you realize that the contact had begun much sooner. And they had started to recognize that they were in the presence of a threat with those instincts. And those instincts are a gift. And that's why it calls it a gift. But for whatever reason, oftentimes the reason may be even noble, not wanting to judge people necessarily, they ignored it. And then that's what caused them to become a victim. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is, what greater gift can you give somebody than freedom from exploitation by physical means? And that only comes from violence or the ability to threaten violence. And that's never changed, and that never will change. And, that's why partially in the beginning of the book, I also talk about things like pacifism and why it's not just that they don't work, they're also immoral. All of us, every one of us has a moral obligation to engage in conflict when you come into contact with someone who wants to severely hurt you, your children, or innocent people around you. And the only way you're going to manage somebody who's committed to doing you harm is by being capable of executing and threatening violence. And that is a gift. It's a gift to give people, one of the most important gifts that everybody should have so they can walk through their life free.
Naturally, you have many friends that are not in martial arts, like everybody. Do you what your friends outside martial arts think about your passion and your book, for example? People who's totally outside the world of martial arts and combat sports.
I'll say I certainly have a few friends that are outside the martial arts world, but not many. Most of the people that I associate with are either part of SBG or involved in what I do in some way. And even some of my friends who were, intellectuals and writers and things like that previously had no connection to martial arts. Now they do.
Okay.
It's amazing how many people have taken up Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like when you talk to writers and intellectuals and college professors, and more often than not, I after talking to them a little bit, I find out that they're actually training somewhere and they've taken up the art. And it's very addictive and very popular right now with all kinds of people. So being honest, probably like the vast majority of people I talk to and know also to one degree or another train.
Okay. So you got not many friends that play jokes with you, like, so you play martial arts, you defend ourselves, so it's better not to make you angry, stuff like that. You don't have it. You're like,
no, I mean, I've certainly run into that before in parties and stuff, but no, that doesn't make me angry. And no, I just I'm very fortunate that I have, people say you're a lucky person if you have one or two friends that you can really count on. I'm very fortunate that I have a lot, and most of them are also do what I do, which I don't think is a coincidence. And I have 6 kids, several companies, my gym, my own stuff. So I don't have a lot of time. So the time that I do have to hang out with people, I like to spend with my the friends that I care a lot about. So I'm just not really.
They all play martial arts already?
Huh? The kids?
Your kids all play martial arts?
They do. Not the littlest one because she's not a year old yet, but the rest of them do. Yeah.
Okay. Steven Pinker, the philosopher, and not the psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a book whose title is "The Better Angels of Our Nature:
Right.
Why Violence Has Declined."
Mm-hmm.
And he says that we are living in the most peaceful era What do you think about it? Because our perception is different.
No, that's empirically true. It's actually the first chapter of my book, and I quote Pinker a few times and talk about that book. That's a great book, and I would recommend everybody read it. He's talking big picture, right? And there's no denying it. The data's there. So if you look at a long-term graph going back centuries, the further back you go, the more violent we were. The most violent time in America, in the Americas, I should say, was before the Europeans arrived. And we know that from archaeological digs, especially amongst some of the Southwest Native Americans in the Southwest area, where the homicide rate was extraordinary. They were, a lot of them were engaged in almost constant warfare and cannibalism and attacking. And so every generation you go back, it tends to be a little rougher than the next one that comes about. Now that's long term. Short term, of course, there's spikes and trends. And since George Floyd in the United States, we had the largest spike in homicides that the country's seen in several decades. And violence is certainly not on a decline at the moment in a lot of our bigger cities. And depending on where you go, I live in Portland, Oregon. Homicides in Portland have tripled since George Floyd, and the shootings have more than tripled. And then we've got all kinds of other crime and property crime that's kind of going out of control. That's
Do
bad.
you think also one of the reasons can be that the laws for policemen is harder and harder?
That's 100% one of the reasons.
All the cameras, the telephones are on these guys that puts their lives in dangers for people, and they don't know how to manage violence anymore because everybody is pointing the spotlight on them.
Yeah, it's one of the chapters in my book is called "Are Police a Threat?" And what I do in that is I address the BLM narrative, which I talk about with you here briefly. But that was one of the biggest fallacies, biggest hoaxes I think perpetrated on the world in the 20th century was the BLM narrative. This idea that American police officers are going around hunting black suspects or killing unarmed black men. And when you poll Americans about that, depending on which side of the political spectrum they're on, if they lean to the left, which in America is more, liberal, democratic, how many unarmed black Americans do you think police shoot every year? The majority will say 1,000 or more. And I think it was even like, I quote the exact numbers in my book so people can look it up, but I think it's like 22 or 23% thought 10,000, which is insane if you think about it.
Yep.
The actual number, and it's been consistent for several decades, and you can track this through the FBI, the BJS, or even the Washington Post had been tracking this data since Ferguson, is about 12. So in a nation of about 360, 370 million people every year, there's about 12 unarmed black males who are shot by police. Now, there's so few that you can look at each case individually. And if you do, you'll see that unarmed doesn't mean they're not trying to kill the officer. One case is trying to run the officer over in a car. In another case, it was a female officer on the ground, and the suspect is trying to bash her head in with a radio. All those things get considered unarmed, okay? And those are righteous shootings. Those are situations where the officer not only had to shoot, they should have shot, and they did. If you remove that from the data, you're left with one or two a year. That's it. And in almost every single one of those cases, the officers are prosecuted. So there never was this huge problem of officers shooting black Americans. It's non-existent. It was a myth, and the media perpetuated it. They played some games with statistics where they talk about how black suspects were more likely to be shot. They'd say, well, 40% of the people shot in this given precinct happen to be black, which is true. But what they fail to mention is that 60 or 70% of the crime in that neighborhood happens to occur in the black neighborhood. The officers are in those neighborhoods not because they want to shoot black people, but that's where the crime is. That's also where the victims are, and their victims are also black, right? And the media doesn't talk about that. All they focus on is officer was white, suspect was black, and then they play that film over and over again and get people whipped up into a frenzy. And then you had here in Portland almost 2 years of nonstop riots, to the point where the media stopped covering it. But every single night you had idiot, mostly wealthy white kids downtown Portland burning down businesses and attacking police officers. What happens in a situation like that? Well, I'll tell you what happens. It's happened nationwide. Any officer that's close to retiring retires. Any officer that thinks he can retire early retires early. Anybody else with a lot of education or experience that can transfer into a different kind of job does. And there has been this massive flood of people fleeing from law enforcement. The most experienced, best people that we have nationwide have now quit doing law enforcement, to the point where the cities, like here in Portland, have to lower the standards to try and get more people. If they had an opening for a police officer in Portland 10 years ago, you would have had 2,000 people apply with college degrees, want that job. Now you'd be lucky if you got 10. And so the standards get lowered even more because they need the police. You add on to that the idiotic defund the police movement, which was one of the dumbest things that's ever happened in United States politics. And you have a recipe for disaster. And the people who have been exploiting this, the bad guys, the gangs, they've been taking advantage of this. They know the police aren't out there and they're shooting each other.
Criminals.
Fortunately, a lot of officers now are also training functional martial arts. I went to the training center here in Portland last year, and they're training. They're doing good stuff. They're doing what they should be doing. The problem is they don't even have time to get training, right? They get like I think it's an hour and a half a year of training mandated by the police department. Wrap your mind around that. 90 minutes a year is all they're given, right? And even if they wanted to do more, like, for example, if I was going to go down there and work with them, which I'd be happy to do, and they have other people that are just as qualified as I am that are there that could help them, they can't because there's not enough officers on the street to be able to rotate them out to train. So the only way the officers get training is if they train on their own time, and they have to kind of sign up at an academy like mine and do that. And they should, because that's their job, and many do. But everything since George Floyd has gotten worse. The quality of policing has gotten worse. It's more dangerous for the suspect. It's more dangerous for the officers. It's been a huge clusterfuck, for lack of better terms. So that is why you've seen this spike. And it's been an 88% increase in homicide in the Black community. So I can sum it up that way. What was the result of the BLM movement? An 88% rise in Black homicide rate. That's what's happened. Meanwhile, the people who headed up that organization have made millions of dollars and bought homes in all white neighborhoods. That's what's happened.
I don't want to push you through politics, but do you think it's on purpose, all this?
Yes, it's 100% on purpose. The media knows, but they love it. They love stoking the racial animosity. It gets them ratings. CNN loves it. They salivate over it. They have no ethics when it comes to this kind of thing. Politicians know. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats and everybody else involved, they knew what would happen. They knew that the homicide rate in the Black community would go up. They knew there'd be a lot of dead kids, little kids that get shot in drive-by shootings in places like Chicago every weekend. They just don't care.
Yeah.
If they think they can get a few more votes, they'll do it every time.
In Italy, we have different problems. We don't have the BLM. But anyway, we have some problems with all the guys that coming from Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a mess, especially in some areas in big towns like train stations. It's becoming really, really dangerous.
Yeah.
Talking about your books, I
Yeah.
would like to know something about how the structure of your book. How did you organize the book?
That's a good question. That's actually what I discovered is the single hardest thing about writing nonfiction, is learning how to organize it. It really is hard, because when you're writing fiction, you have a plot, right? You have a story that takes you through. And so figuring out where to put what took me a long time and a lot of trial by error. And I had a lot of help from my editors and my publishers in doing that. But I basically start with a brief history of violence. I talk about Steven Pinker and the decline and short-term rise and evolutionary roots of it. And then I have a chapter on truth and how to think critically about the issue, because I want people to understand and have that epistemology. I do believe that the epistemology is more important than the answer, both in martial arts and in philosophy. It's not it's not the answer that is important. It's how you arrived at the answer. It's not the conclusion, how you arrived at the conclusion. It's not the technique, it's the training method, right? And so I have a chapter in that to try and pass that on to people. And then we start to talk about what I think is the most important aspects of violence, which begins with maturity, moves through intelligence, and then noticing things around you. And then finally, we get to the decision-making process that happens, which is the D part of the MIND acronym. So that's kind of how my book is organized from start to finish. And it does tell a story. It has a narrative in there. And along the way, I share some personal stories, things that things that have happened to me or that are relevant in the martial arts training to help articulate some of the principles that I have in the book and help carry the book along. But that was probably the single hardest thing about writing the book, was figuring out how to organize it that way.
Was it necessary for you to collect many different subjects like history, psychology, anthropology, and studies on animals
Yes.
to write the books?
Yeah, it is necessary.
And did you use many friends or professional figures to help you write this book?
I do. I'm fortunate. I have a lot of smart friends and people who are involved in different things. One of my students and good friends is Peter Boghossian, who's a critical thinking professor, who's become relatively famous in the States these days for standing up to a lot of the woke bullshit in the university system. But he's been really helpful. I have other friends and colleagues and students and peers that are evolutionary biologists that I would go to for questions, or when I was talking about evolution, I want to make sure I get the specifics correct. Psychologists, like I said, violence is a huge topic, so it encompasses everything from brain scans and prefrontal lobe and our reactions and different types of aggression, the psychology behind it, the evolution behind it. All of that is incorporated in the book in a way that I hope is accessible for people who, like me, are laymen on the subject and don't have a deep scientific background. You shouldn't need that to understand the book. I try and write clearly for people.
What kind of animal is a human being? What do you think when you think about the man? What kind of animal you imagine?
I think there's more beauty in the world than there is ugliness, and I think it's easy to forget. One of the things when you're focused on self-defense or you're focused on a topic like violence, which can be depressing, a lot of the stories I tell in the book and things are there's no other way to say it. They're depressing because you're talking about horrible things. It's easy to forget that there's also great people, good people doing good things everywhere, all around you, right? And they're not the ones that make the news. That's the other thing. If you only consume news, right? If you just sat around all day and read the paper, or worse, watched the garbage on the network newscasts, you would think that the world was hell, but it's not. There's everywhere you go, whether we're here in Portland or Italy or wherever, there's lots of fantastic people doing wonderful things for non-selfish reasons. So I think it's easy to forget that. At the same time, I believe in what Hobbes said, and that we do have our essential nature, and we're always just a thin veneer away from savagery, right? And if all of a sudden the power went out for a week and the police stopped responding to calls, or even a day or two, I'm under no illusions about what would happen, and it's easy to forget that because we live as Pinker rightly said, in the most civilized time of all compared to our ancestors. And hopefully it'll be even better for my kids. But that possibility is always there, right? You could have a solar flare tomorrow and wipe out all the electronics around the earth. And within a year, 90% of our population would die of starvation. And you'd have roaming bands of people traveling around, killing each other or murdering each other. I mean, that's there. It exists, right? It's not going to go away. So I think a healthy approach is to keep both things in mind. There's a lot of beauty and a lot of wonderful people around us. And most people, I think, are generally good. Most people are as good as you or I are. But there's evil in the world too. And it's always been there, and it's always going to be there, and it's not going anywhere. And the only thing that keeps it in check is good people who are capable of doing dangerous things to bad people.
Hmm. You know, mm, I usually read and see many videos also from Jordan Peterson,
Mm-hmm.
and he always stretches the fact that to be dangerous also.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you agree, and you also talked about that,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
good people must be dangerous.
One of my favorite sayings, which is kind of in a way, it's one of our gym mottos for SBG, actually comes from a friend of mine, fellow instructor Paul Sharp, which is one of our objectives here at SBG is to make good people dangerous to bad people. That's
Mhm.
what we want to do. Make good people more dangerous to bad people, and that's really important, And it's the only thing that really does keep people safe. And it's a noble project and something that I love to do. And in Peterson's case, it's also a prerequisite in many ways for being truly good. I mean, if you're capable of doing great harm to someone, but you choose not to, that's very different from someone who doesn't have a choice anyway, chooses not
Yeah.
to, but they wouldn't even be capable of it if they wanted to, right? And the last thing I'll say about that is, and I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, but anytime you're training in a functional martial art, it doesn't have to be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it could be wrestling, could be boxing, whatever, but in any functional martial art, there's a process of losing that is necessary. And like I tell my students every day, it's on the mat, pretty much every class, failure is not just okay, it's actually essential. It's a necessary part of the process. You're going to fail over and over again, whether you're doing boxing or judo or wrestling. You're going to get thrown, you're going to get punched, you're going to get tapped out. I've been submitted, tapped out untold 1,000 times, right? As many times as I've tapped people out, or if not more, I've been tapped out. There's no way you can get good at this art without that happening. It's impossible. And when you put yourself through that process, it also changes people. I've seen kids come in and watch their entire the way they interact with reality change completely over the course of 1 or 2 years from training in a functional martial art. It's really quite a beautiful thing. So it's good for people. It's a healthy thing to do, for everybody.
How important is for you is the concept of handling chaos?
I'm not sure that chaos would be the word I would use, but there is an element of the unknown that's always going to exist in any kind of violent altercation, right? Or even training situation in the gym. When you're dealing with a live opponent, you're dealing with somebody else who has their own intentions, their own objectives, their own goals. It's like people many years ago, when we were talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, they specifically talking about law enforcement, they would say, well, the police officers don't want to be on the ground. Why would they train to be on the ground? I'm like, dude, it's a fight. You're not going to get to choose where you wind up off. That's why it's called a fight. All of a sudden, you're going to be talking to one person and someone else tackles you from the side or from behind, and you find yourself on the ground. You need to know how to deal with that. Doesn't matter whether you want to be there. You have to be able to deal with wherever you are put. And that's the nature of fighting. You have to be adaptable. Being adaptable is very, very important. Being able to adapt to changing circumstances in the heat of the moment. And there's nothing that better prepares you for that in terms of the physical than a live training. That's part of what I talk about. It's, in a way, it's a part of intelligence, is being able to adapt. One of the most important things we do is one of the things that makes us so dangerous as humans. And in jiu-jitsu, you learn that every time you roll. Right? You can't, if you're trying to force your game on somebody else who's good in jiu-jitsu, it doesn't usually go well. You have to work with what they're giving you and find a way to make that work. And every single opponent, every single training partner that you tap hands with and roll with is going to be a little bit different. And they're going to have their own different routes. They're going to have their own different intentions, and you've got to be able to go there. And you have to learn how to be comfortable in very uncomfortable situations. That's the other thing. So people who never find themselves in uncomfortable situations, when they're put in an uncomfortable situation, will often panic, which is obviously the worst thing you can do in any given situation, is panic. And one of the things that jiu-jitsu teaches people to do very well is it teaches them how to be calm in situations where they're very uncomfortable. You can't over the years, you're going to be put in all kinds of situations that are extremely uncomfortable, and you got to learn how to find comfort there and survive and be able to breathe and overcome it. And then lo and behold, you actually win the altercation. Eventually, you find a way out, right? But that's a skill set. It's a skill set that if you're in the military, you learn through training, whether you're a Navy SEAL or whatever else, or if you're a combat athlete and you're an MMA fighter, you learn it, and you learn it through experience, and you learn it through live training. And that's very, very important. And that carries over into your everyday life as well. I mean, being able to find yourself, being able to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations is a very useful skill set for life in general.
Do you already have a title for your next book? You don't
Yeah,
want to talk about it?
I don't have a working, I have a few ideas, but it'll probably be something like, training for the gift of violence, or training the gift of something like that. So the next book is going to be very specifically targeted to training methods.
Okay. I have one last question, and it's
Sure.
not about martial arts.
Okay.
You love music?
I love music.
What do you hear when you train, if you hear something when you train?
Yes, I play music in all my classes usually. And how it works is when I'm teaching, I'll have the music off. And usually what we do is I'll show them something, position or something that we're working on, and make sure everybody in class can do it mechanically correct, which doesn't take that long. And then we drill. And when we drill in SPG, it's always live. So to an outsider, our drilling would very much look like sparring to a lot of people. And when we're drilling, the music comes on. And I have a very eclectic taste, so I like all kinds of different music. So, all kinds of everything from jazz to rock and roll to country to who knows what's going to pop up on my playlist. But yeah, that's a big part of our training. I've always loved training to music.
Okay. Matt, I thank you. I thank you again. Do you want to add something about your book?
No, I appreciate you having me on. You can pick up the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, IndieShare, all the places books are bought and sold. My personal website is mattthornton.org. And if they're interested in the gym, they can go to straightbossgym.com. And as far as training, we have spguniversity.com, where my classes here in Portland go up online every week. And no matter where they are in the world, they can take class with me if they want to. So anybody that's interested, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk to them.
Okay, and there is the description of all the info about Matt Thornton in the description of this video below. In the meantime, Matt, it's been really a pleasure to have you here, and thanks for accepting my invitation once
Thank you,
again.
buddy. It's been nice to meet you.
Thank you again. See you next time. Bye, guys. Thanks for coming, and see you again. Bye, Matt. Thanks again.
Thank you, man. I'll talk to you soon.